Every year, the HACR Symposium gathers together the most influential diversity stakeholders dedicated to Hispanic inclusion in corporate America today. Hispanic leaders, Fortune 500 executives, ERG leaders, and diversity and human resource professionals all gather for this one-of-a-kind experience. Immerse yourself in exclusive seminars and networking events hosted by a hand-picked group of influencers, leading executives, and elite Fortune 500 CEOs. Come grow with us as a professional, and come join our ever-expanding community.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Vanessa Bowling-Adjavon, and I'm the Director of Administration and Human Resources here at HACR, and I have the pleasure of hosting today's webinar. We're very excited for today's discussion. During the webinar, you will learn more about the state of women and minorities on corporate boards. Before we begin, I would like to recognize today's sponsors, the Coca-Cola Company and USAA. The Coca-Cola Company has been a long-time supporter of HACR, and they deserve a huge thank you for their partnership and for their commitment to Hispanic inclusion. To give a few remarks on behalf of the Coca-Cola Company, we welcome Peter Villegas, Vice President and Head, Office of Latin Affairs. Welcome, Peter.
Welcome. Welcome, everybody. Can you see me? Am I hitting the right button? Okay. How are you? On behalf of the Coca-Cola Company, we'd like to thank you for being with us today. We're excited to be here. We're excited about our partnership with HACR, as always. Speaking of important issues in corporate America, I'd be remiss if I did not let folks know that we have some great news at Coca-Cola. Last week, we announced that our new president of Coca-Cola North America is Mr. Alfredo Rivera, Latino, that will lead all of our efforts and strategy across North America. So that's a fantastic news. We're excited about it, and we look forward to terrific results and continued engagement under Alfredo's leadership. And I just like to say that while our attention is focused on so many issues, important issues across the world, I'd like to congratulate HACR and Cid and staff for keeping us focused on this important issue of corporate board diversity. As an example, I'm here in Los Angeles. As an example, California just passed a landmark bill that would require companies based in California to have a diverse board. That's how important this issue is. So again, I'd like to thank Cid. I'd like to thank HACR. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. Enjoy your Coca-Cola or whatever brand of products under our portfolio you enjoy, and really take advantage of this important webinar. I know that it'll be extremely helpful to all of us. So I'll leave you with our Coca-Cola video, but again, thanks for participating.
The day the world stopped was the day we found where to go. Lost together, we discovered ourselves again. And we realized that the things that matter deserve time.
That looks good.
From now on, we're not going to leave anything on our plates. Because we've learned to savor the moments that were always there. And they never tasted this good.
Thank you so much, Peter. I would also like to recognize our next sponsor, USAA. Thank you, USAA, for your support. Together, we work to achieve our mutual goal of greater diversity and Hispanic inclusion. Please enjoy this short video. Thank you again to the Coca-Cola Company and USAA for your support. Have you heard? We're going virtual. HACR's inaugural virtual event will be held on September 29, 2020, and registration is now open. Please follow us on social media to receive important details about this and future events. Now, just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel at any time. Questions are only visible by our team, and questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be emailed to all webinar registrants and posted on our archive page at HACR.org. All right, that's it. So now, without further ado, I'd like to pass it to Cid Wilson to introduce himself and today's speakers. Cid?
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I appreciate that. And bienvenidos and welcome to our Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility webinar on the topic of trends in corporate board diversity. As all of you know, one of our major pillars at HACR is of course governance. Of course, we have employment, procurement, philanthropy, and governance is a key pillar of HACR. This is a topic that we have been working diligently for over 34 years, and this is an important topic, especially today as we think about diversity from the front line all the way up to the corporate boards, which is what we'll be talking about today. But I'm also very excited about today's webinar, not only because of the timeliness of things that are happening in current events, but also because of the fact that this is a topic that is not always as understood in terms of not only what is happening on boards, what's the profile of board directors, what are we seeing in terms of changes when it comes to diversity on boards, and other topics that I think are very important. I'm really excited that we have one of the foremost authorities on diversity on corporate boards who will be presenting, and her name is DeHaas. She is the vice chairman at Deloitte. She has been at Deloitte for over 30 years. We're also very excited because you know, Deb is someone that is not only has detailed understanding of corporate board diversity, but she has been at this for many years, and of course we work very closely with her, not only with HACR and Deloitte, but also the Alliance for Board Diversity, which includes the Executive Leadership Council, Catalyst, and the Leadership Education for Asian Pacifics, also known as LEAP. So without further ado, I present to you my very good friend, Deb DeHaas, the Vice Chairman for Deloitte. Deb.
Great, thank you, Cid. Hopefully you can hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that really lovely and warm introduction. It's such a privilege to be here today, and please know how pleased and proud we are to have such a close working relationship with HACR and also with all the members of the Alliance for Board Diversity that you commented on. I'm really excited to see you have a great audience here today. I have a few slides that I will talk from, but really what Cid and I hope is that this will become more of a conversation, and certainly we'll welcome questions from all of you in the audience. So why don't we go to the first slide? And as Cid mentioned, actually, let's go to the next slide. As Cid mentioned, I'm a senior partner and one of our vice chairmen at Deloitte. And this graphic that's coming up on the screen right now, albeit it seems to be stuck here a little bit, albeit a little bit slowly, but when it hopefully does populate, or if it, there we go, what it'll hopefully depict is what for us at Deloitte has been a really long journey around diversity and inclusion. In fact, this journey at Deloitte started almost 30 years ago, and it really started then with what we called our Women's Initiative, or WIN, and that really resulted because at the time, Deloitte is a very large accounting and professional services firm, as well as the broad-based consultancy set of services that we provide. What we were finding is women were leaving in significantly larger numbers than men. And we actually worked with the Catalyst organization to understand why that was. And our Women's Initiative was launched. It was shortly thereafter followed by our Diversity Initiative. And again, over this 25+ year journey, we've really focused on making Deloitte a very diverse organization, but particularly I would say in the last 6 or 7 years, we've really focused extensively on the importance of being inclusive as well. And so I was really privileged to take on the role as our Chief Inclusion Officer at Deloitte in 2012, a role I held for more than 6 years and stepped away from about 2 years ago. I've also had the opportunity to lead our Center for Board Effectiveness. So as Cid said, this opportunity to bring together the role I had around diversity and inclusion at Deloitte, as well as to think about the implications for governance and diversity in the boardroom. Hopefully I'll have some insights to share with you here today. A few things that have come from the results of our work at Deloitte. First of all, we are very proud of the progress we've made, but I would tell you we are not at all satisfied with where we are. And some of the issues we had early on, as an example, around a retention gap for women, we've eliminated that completely. In fact, men turn over just slightly more than women, but we know we have more work to do, and particularly around some of the issues of race and equity, as I think every company and organization does here in the United States today. So I just wanted to acknowledge that for sure. In our profession, I'm really proud of our profession. It's been a leader in really focusing on this issue. And at Deloitte, we like to think at most times we've been out in front of our profession, but what we do find is we're all very fast followers. But we were the first among the Big Four to have the first woman chairman, the first minority CEO, the first minority chairman, and we had our first female CEO as well. We also, with Janet Foudy, who's now the chairman of our Deloitte board, we had the first large consultancy firm to have a woman CEO. Janet served in that role. And our Deloitte board diversity journey hasn't been quite as long as our overall journey, but I would tell you since the early 2000s, when we did elect our first woman chairman, Sharon Allen, we've really focused on the importance of diversity in our boardroom. We are a private partnership, so our board, we do not disclose our information publicly, but what I can share with you, and I again had the privilege of sitting on our board for 2 terms, is that today of our board of 20 people, we're more than 60% women and minorities on our board. And I know from her firsthand experience that has really resulted in us bringing different thinking and I think better governance solutions to our firm. So a lot of progress, a lot of things we're very proud of. We've been on a lot of lists, but we know we still have a lot of work to do. And I think that's very much what's happening around board diversity as well. So if we want to go to the next slide, I'll just try to provide a little bit of context on what's happening in today's boardroom, and then we'll get into some specifics around board diversity. So if we go to the next slide, the source for this data is Spencer Stuart. And I think many of you hopefully know Spencer Stuart, a very large executive search firm. Many of the search firms pull together similar information. I think Spencer Stuart puts an excellent report together called their Board Index every year, which is available online. And so this data is as of last fall, as of 2019. And this focuses on the S&P 500 boards. And so what you see is that, first of all, CEOs have predominantly been sort of the board members of choice for many years. And in fact, almost half of S&P 500 CEOs serve on one or more outside corporate boards in addition to their own. What has happened are a couple things. Over the last number of years, as CEO roles, as you all know, are very demanding, we've seen actually fewer CEOs serving on outside boards just because of the demands of their own organizations. And so as a result, and also most of those boards have limited their outside board service to typically one other public company board in addition to their own board. So what has happened is that actually, which I think is a really positive thing in terms of just broader diversity of both experience, perspective, but it does impact overall diversity, because as we know, there are still today very few sitting CEOs who are either women or minorities in either the S&P or Fortune 500. So what's happened, as you can see in 2019, roughly 2/3 of those new board members, and there were a little under 500 new board members, so about less than one per board, came from the C-suite, from the CEO position. So that means they're looking at people who bring different perspectives and experiences, and perhaps who aren't quite as far up in the C-suite. Having said that, about 23% of them were leading either a division, a subsidiary, they were in a SVP, functional, or EVP role. And what you do tend to see is that people who come from a finance executive background are highly sought after. There's only one role that's required on a public company board, and that's that you have to have at least one financial expert on the audit committee. They don't have to chair it. And so those people tend to be highly sought after. And as you can see, almost half of the audit committees are chaired by either a current or former financial executive or someone who came out of public accounting. And so I think, again, a lot of positives around the diversity of what's happening in terms of backgrounds of people joining boards. And I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit later on. What are some of those skill sets that are being sought after? Technology skills are very hot. They have been for the last number of years. Certainly people who might bring a digital or marketing perspective, cyber and other risk-related skills are highly valued. But as I talk to board members and as searches are going on today, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, I think what we're seeing is certainly the talent agenda is very robust, given all the challenges of COVID. And so CHROs, Chief Human Resource Officers, and other people who have experience with talent are definitely being sought after. The other thing I think that's interesting when you look at retired executives, they are able to serve on typically more than one board, and so it's not uncommon that a number of retired executives will sit on multiple boards. And again, as you can see, there are 64% independent directors in the S&P 500 sit on more than one public company board. So let's go to the next slide. And unless, Cid, there's anything you want to ask or talk about relative to sort of the current landscape.
Just one question, Deb, is that, one question that I know I get and many others get is professionals who are in their 40s and they feel like they're behind because they haven't got on their first corporate board. Can you talk about the profile from an age standpoint in terms of like the average age of a board director, and maybe even the average age of getting your first corporate board?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so these numbers I'm going to give are going to be a bit directional. But interestingly, if you look at sort of the average age of corporate board members, it's in the low 60s. That number has not changed that much. But what I think has happened is that the ends of the spectrum have changed, which is why that that number in the middle the average hasn't changed all that much. In the last, I would say 8 to 10 years, as people are living longer, they're more vibrant. If there is a mandatory retirement age for board members, that has tended to trend up. And so it wasn't uncommon that that number was 70. 8 to 10 years ago, for most boards, that's moved up to 72 or 75, if there even is an age limit. But what I think we are seeing is, previously, you just didn't see that many people under 50 that were joining their first corporate board. And I talked about the strong desire for technology and digital skills, given the digital transformation that most organizations are going through. And so increasingly, there are younger board members, even board members in their 30s, who are in some cases joining very large established companies. And I think certainly many of the tech startups that ultimately become public companies have a younger set of board members. So I think there is actually a lot of focus on both diversity of an age, more so than it was in the past. And the other thing that certainly some of the outside investors are looking at is, what's the average tenure of boards? They don't want directors to become stale. So they're really tracking, are there board members that have 10 or 15 years of experience? The thinking is, gee, perhaps those board members are getting a bit too close to management. In fact, in the UK and in many European companies, after 9 years on a public company board, you're no longer considered an independent director because of just the tenure you've had on the board. So I think some positive trends there for sure. Cid, I'm going to talk a little bit about our missing pieces data. And again, this is an effort that I know we're really proud at Deloitte to be partnering with the Alliance for Board Diversity. The Alliance actually goes back to 2004, when they initially started to track the Fortune 100. We've been able to expand that research to the Fortune 500 companies. And again, we were proud to start partnering with ABD back in 2016. And basically, when the missing pieces report was started, the objective was, and Cid, maybe you'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but the objective was, because boards were less diverse at that time, was the hope that there could be a 40% diversity achieved by these large public company boards. And that would be the combination of both gender, race and ethnicity in terms of how diversity was being evaluated. So over this period of time, there's been a number of additions, and in 2018, that was the 5th edition of this information. So the information we're sharing is a little bit dated, but I'll just give you a stay tuned here, because the research is underway on 2020. As we speak, we used the June 30th cutoff for that data in 2020. And so we hope towards the end of this calendar year and in early 21 to be releasing that information. But I think a couple things are noteworthy. So first, on that, are we going to hit the 40% by 2020? That was ultimately the goal in 2004. We don't know that, but what it looked like in 2018 is that if the trends continued, that would be achieved by the year 2024. So not going to hit that deadline, perhaps. We'll see, hopefully, some more progression in the most recent set of data that we'll be evaluating. But we did see some acceleration of change between 2016 and 2018, which I think is really quite positive. We also saw that between 2016 and 2018, the largest percentage increase in board seats occurred for African American and Black women, as well as Asian Pacific Islander women. And you can see some of those percentages are quite large: 26.2%, 38.6%. But I'll have a big but here. The pure numbers themselves were pretty small, and so sometimes when you have small numbers, just a handful of directors can give you a big percentage. We also saw that minority men made a reasonably sizable increase between 2016 and 2018, growing by about 1%. Again, that feels still too slow, I think, to most of us. But what was noteworthy is that in 2 years, that 1% gain was almost the same as what was achieved in the previous 12 years. So definitely some things to note and some progress. As we go to the next slide, I'll just highlight a few other trends here, Cid, and then maybe we can talk a little bit more about the data. But again, I think some positive things that have been seen. First of all, one trend overall that's just interesting is that the larger companies tend to have more diverse boards. So the Fortune 100, when you look at all of their board seats combined, are in fact more diverse than the Fortune 500. And so, you know, as an example, in the Fortune 100, about 61% of those board seats are held by white men. In the Fortune 500, it's about 66%. So larger companies tend to be more diverse in terms of their board, and that's kind of across the board in terms of the statistics. Another thing that we've seen in terms of hitting this 40% goal, pretty noteworthy that in 2018, 46 out of the 100 Fortune 100 companies had 40% or more diversity on their board. So almost half of them had achieved that milestone, which is pretty noteworthy. And that was a pretty dramatic increase from it being 33 in 2016. In the Fortune 500, about a third of the Fortune 500, 145 of 500, had hit that 40% milestone. And again, a pretty significant increase. In 2016, only 95, so less than 20% had hit that milestone. So I think some things that are really good trends. When you do dig into the data, there's a couple of other points that I think are noteworthy. And particularly in the Fortune 500, what we've seen is that most of the change that's occurred has been gender diversity versus race ethnicity. And in fact, the largest number of seats that were gained were by white women. About 124 seats were gained. So that's, I think, something to continue to watch. We'll talk about the current environment, and I do think, particularly given the increased level of attention to issues around race and equity, there's a lot more dialogue around the need to make more progress. So again, I'm not sure our 2020 data will show as much progress as we might hope, but in the current environment, and certainly Peter talked about this earlier with perhaps legislation and just many companies thinking this is the right thing to do, hopefully we're going to see more progress from a race and ethnicity perspective as we continue to move forward. So Cid, I'll just stop there. Those were a couple observations. Anything else you'd want to talk about just about our missing pieces data?
Sure. Well, for one, this is a very important report that we put together every year in partnership with Deloitte, and obviously, ABT is very proud of our relationship with Deloitte on this important project. And so, thank you, Deb, for your leadership over these many years. One question that I think would be of interest to our attendees is that yes, we've been seeing an increase in more white Caucasian women on boards, but what are you seeing in terms of women of color, and then another maybe even a follow-up to that question is that are we seeing more movement on the B2B companies, or I'm sorry, the B2C companies versus the B2B companies? Because we know that sometimes the companies that are much more consumer driven tend to be a little more sensitive to diversity and inclusion compared to the B2Bs. But if you can talk about those topics, that'd be great.
Yeah, I will. So just a couple points. So, on the slide previously, we did talk about the fact that between 2016 and 2018, some of the largest percentage gains that we saw, were in minority women, both African American and Black women, and Asia Pacific Islander women as well. So, some positive trends. We did not see significant change in the Hispanic Latina population. And so certainly I think, particularly knowing many who attend your webcast, that's probably of note and of interest for sure. So I think a lot more focus needing to be done there for sure. I think as you, okay, so Sid, I'm like just thinking about the second part of your question. So the first was, are we thinking
B companies versus B2C?
Oh yeah, thank you. Okay, thank you. It's interesting. I think it was very easy, I think, early on for there to be an understanding of, in a consumer-based company, why bringing some of those diverse perspectives, both into executive leadership and in the boardroom, made more sense. And I think that we are seeing more trends there. And honestly, I think in some cases it's been a bit of an education. I remember going a few years ago to a company board that was actually had no women or minorities on their board. They were getting quite a bit of pressure from one of their investors because of their lack of diversity. So we went and just actually shared some of the data from our missing pieces report. We talked about the business case for diversity, and a few of the men, they had just actually added a very senior retired military leader, and you could tell he came from a background where metrics and accountability were very much built into his DNA, and so he started asking a lot of questions as well, and there was a belief that perhaps because they were in an industrial company, they were in logistics, in industrial related industries, they didn't think there were women who would necessarily have experience in those arenas. And we and some others were able to provide them some candidates who brought terrific experience from some of the most sophisticated logistics companies in the world, and had some of the global experience that they thought was really critical. And it was, I think, a bit of an aha moment for them. So, one myth I do want to debunk. Often it's been said they're just, hey, we'd love to have diverse people on our board. There just aren't enough qualified candidates. That is a myth. I think you and I would feel strongly about that needs to be debunked. There are a tremendous number of qualified candidates from a gender, race, ethnicity, and experience perspective, but they may not be as well known. And one of the things our missing pieces report does measure, Sid, as you know, is what we call sort of the this ratio that really looks at, are we recycling the same board members over and over again? And what you find is that the board members who are recycled the least are in fact white and Caucasian men, and the ones that are recycled the most tend to be diverse women. So this is about, I think, opening the aperture. We'll talk about best practices on how you find more diverse board members in a moment, but this is about needing to go beyond sort of the usual suspects. We know there's, I think at this point, less than 5 African American CEOs in the Fortune 500 as an example. I'm pretty confident they're already booked on at least one outside board, right? So, if you're going to have to look at a broader set of candidates, and I think that many organizations and companies are starting to do that. So I'm just going to really quickly, if we go to the next slide, I don't want to spend a lot of time on the next couple of slides, but and we'll make sure all of you get these afterwards. But if you go to the next slide, we have a few slides here that do talk about, what's the business case. And I think the fact that you're on a webinar of this type, you understand the business case. But I think for many, it is really important for them to believe that there's true value of bringing diversity into either the executive ranks or into the C-suite or into the boardroom. And so, there's a number of studies that have some quantitative elements around innovation, around EBITDA or in some cases ROI. And, you know, again, I think what I have found just in my own personal experience, again, this is anecdotal versus, you know, some of the facts, which I think do matter, is that when you bring diverse perspectives into the boardroom, you avoid groupthink. You often find ideas and solutions that haven't been thought of before. So I'm a huge believer that diversity does, you know, translate into real business outcomes. If you go to the next slide here really quickly, you know, this talks a little bit about what are some of the questions, you know, we can be asking that will potentially allow us to think differently about diversity. And again, this is diversity, you know, in the broadest sense. So, you know, back to your point earlier, Cid, as you think about some of the new markets or digital transformation, et cetera, in many boards, if you went back several years ago, it was probably highly likely that they didn't have any of those people, you know, sitting on boards. And I think it was the CEO of Microsoft who recently said that, you know, in a 2-month period, you know, digital transformation probably achieved what would have been on a pace of a 2-year movement. So, you know, you think about the move to online commerce, so many things that have happened in the last 6 months around virtualization and the need to have, you know, very different business models. So I think the questions around, are we going to lose ground if we don't have the right people in our boardroom or on our management teams who really understand how the market is changing and what some of these new business models that are going to be required in the future. I think those are the right questions that people, you know, really need to be asking. If we go to the next slide, one point I do want to make that I think is an important one, and it's this point around diversity and inclusion. And as we've done some research, there's certainly a lot of research around diversity metrics and the impact that brings to organizations. But I think there's been a little bit less around inclusion. And so I think just the other set of questions that both boards should be asking, as well as other executive leadership teams, is the need to have both. And a phrase that I often like to use is that, and I passionately believe this, is that inclusion truly unleashes the power of diversity. And, you know, organizations where diverse leaders can come and feel comfortable about bringing their authentic selves to work, where they know their ideas and experiences are going to be valued, those organizations, they thrive and they really do achieve greater outcomes. So when we looked at, for one of the efforts we did is we actually looked at many of the Fortune 500 companies to see, do they have board charters of committees that are focused on diversity and inclusion? Not that many have them. And in fact, if they did talk about it, it was much more of a narrow diversity lens. So what I'm hopeful is we're going to see an expansion of it. And I hope going forward, it'll be diversity, equity, and inclusion, you know, will be sort of the broader set of topics that'll be viewed as being in the purview of the board. I will say, Cid, something that I know we're seeing at many of our clients, this is a top of mind boardroom topic right now. I mean, given the events of the last few months, you know, many companies have made statements about actions they're going to be taking. Their boards are talking about it. And so certainly one of my hopes is that this topic of diversity, equity, inclusion will retain its prominence on the boardroom agenda, and that we'll see more organizations starting to make progress, hopefully starting with more diverse boards and then having it cascade down throughout the entire organization. Sid, I'll stop there.
Yeah. So Deb, here's one question that that I know comes up very frequently is as diversity and inclusion becomes increasingly a major focus within corporate America. And are you seeing any either anecdotal or information that shows that our chief diversity officers are getting more dotted access to the board, maybe even sometimes direct access to the board where they're making presentations about diversity and inclusion at their companies?
Yeah, it's a great question, Cid. And I think the answer is yes. One of the things that I was really fortunate at Deloitte, I actually reported directly to our CEO as our Chief Inclusion Officer, and I had a seat at the table at our executive committee, and I did report to the board several times per year. And so I know having that seat at the table with as a peer of other business unit leaders and functional leaders inside our firm really made a difference, because it really helped embed diversity and inclusion right into the dialogue of many topics that were not just diversity and inclusion specific, but just broader topics about how we run our business. And as we thought about inclusion, we really wanted to embed it into our talent processes, and that this is just the way we do business. It's not an initiative anymore. This is our talent. It's an imperative for us to do that. I do think it's increasing on the board agenda, and something that I am anticipating is we're going to see what historically had been largely compensation committees of public company boards have a broader agenda with talent, and that we'll see more of those diversity executives having access to the board. And I think more of an effort, by boards to really hold management accountable for making progress. As the whole topic of ESG becomes more of a focus, certainly by many investors, I know many organizations that I've talked to are talking about how some of those ESG, environmental, social, governance issues might be tied to compensation. And some of the early ones that I'm seeing companies really think about linking to compensation are tied into diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is a positive.
Great.
But I'm gonna jump to this next slide real quick, because I know one of the things you wanted me to address is, what are some of the leading practices? What can be done to change the course? So I think I've mentioned a couple of these, but maybe just to reinforce them. So one is, let's really look for skills and competencies, not titles. So it gets back to, there's really a lot of talented people out there who could add huge amounts of value in the boardroom, but they may not have a CEO title. In fact, they probably don't if you're looking for diverse leaders. So, thinking more about their competencies, their skills, experiences versus titles, I think will naturally, lead you to having a broader pool. And I think thinking about that broader pool, I think being inspired by, something the NFL instituted. I'm from Pittsburgh originally, so the Rooneys are the owners of the Steelers. So I'm sort of proud that they were the first to institute the Rooney Rule, which really did require the diverse slate of candidates for every opening. I'm seeing a number of boards now start to mandate that in terms of the slates. And I know that several of the search firms have actually built into their search models a commitment to bringing a diverse slate. I do think what's happening right now, I think some boards are really saying, we want a diverse candidate. So we're going to focus exclusively on a diverse pool. And obviously the likelihood that's going to lead to a good outcome in terms of adding diversity at the board is likely. And I know within Goldman Sachs, they've made some recent announcements about with IPOs that they're going to support requiring more diversity on the board. So I think creating some metrics and some guiding principles of that sort will be important. I think the pipeline is an important part of getting to longer term gains. And you talked about sponsorship earlier on, and I think one of the most important ways that people get on boards is through relationships. And certainly search firms are brought into many searches, but in reality, oftentimes it truly is who the board members know or who knows someone that they know that results in that placement. So I think a real opportunity for senior executives and board members is to think about someone they would sponsor in their organization to who they think is board ready, or they're going to help get board ready, and then really leveraging their network, to position that woman or diverse leader for board service. And I think that's going to be really important. And I strongly believe being on a board is a great developmental opportunity in terms of the value those board members bring. So as you think about positioning leaders for, future movement into the C-suite or into CEO roles in your own organization, I think supporting their board service at another organization is fantastic. Some have compared it to, getting another degree at an institution, and just the opportunity to work with new executives in a board setting, to see different business models, I think is important. And then last, I think just for existing boards, having really robust processes around your own board practices. We talked about the long tenure that's occurring in certain boards. There's a few boards that have term limits, but actually it's pretty small. It's less than 5% of public company boards. So I think if you have very rigorous board assessment processes, the likelihood that you may see some turnover is going to happen. It is interesting. A question that I've thought about in the environment we're operating in today, as you know, many of these boards have just been full on, right? I mean, it was a crisis in the first, pick your period of time. For some organizations, it still is a huge crisis. And first, those boards were focused on, do we even have enough cash to stay open? Employee safety. Do we need to furlough employees? How do we get our employees back to work? So some really hard topics, lots of board meetings. I know we can't sit on any, outside for-profit boards while we're at Deloitte, but I sit on 2 higher ed boards, and, that's an industry that's had a lot of challenges and issues and disruption right now. And I've spent a tremendous amount of time. So just the time commitment, I think it may prompt some individuals to say, gee, I'm not sure that I can really do my day job and my board roles, or I need to cut back on one of my boards because the commitments are too great. And I'm really hoping that creates an opportunity to have organizations think about bringing more diverse candidates to their boards. So I'll just stop there, Cid. There's one more slide that talks a little bit about the current environment, but maybe we'll just flip to that and we can use it as a backdrop, because what I have heard from search firms, and I'd be interested in your perspective, because my guess is your phone and those of some of your members, my guess are ringing kind of off the hook right now. I really think there's been a very strong focus on gender, and for, I would say the last 5 years, organizations like Equilar, Track It, California mandated gender diversity on public company boards several years ago. That brought more diversity. And so, I think these are all very recent headlines in the news. And Peter talked about the recent legislation that was, I think it's still waiting for a signature, but I would be shocked if it didn't get signed, that would mandate by the end of 2021 that there'd be at least one person of color on a public company board in California. So, and by the way, investors are now asking for more from companies in terms of goals, disclosures. You can see the headline here from State Street from last week. So I really think there's a lot of momentum to see change. And I think there was a recent article even this week in the Wall Street Journal that named a number of large public companies, some of the brand names that are large consumer, but also some of the more B2B companies that have recently added either their first or additional African American and Black leaders to the boardrooms to try to get more representation.
Sorry, I was on mute. Let me ask one last question, then I want to make sure I get some questions from the audience as well, as we've been getting some of them. Is that you talked about the fact that there are some of these very prominent nonprofit boards that sometimes can be a way to build that network. Do you have any insights on what you're seeing in terms of nonprofit boards being a platform to get on a board? I know that one of the things that we talk about at ASET, because as you mentioned, we are getting a lot of phone calls about board service. And one of the things that I often share with attendees that talk to me is that, as you're thinking about working with your company to sponsor you to serve on a nonprofit board, given that many of them have very sometimes high give-get ratios, is that sometimes those kinds of boards will have board directors who also serve on a corporate board, and then when they get asked for their third or their fourth board seat, which they turn down, there's a good chance that they're going to recommend someone that's on their board. But what are you seeing in terms of that opportunity to get noticed to get on a corporate board?
Yeah, I think it's a great. Personally, I'm a huge proponent of nonprofit board service. That's just a core value that goes way back in my family history. But I know I've been really privileged to serve on a number of nonprofit boards. I live in Chicago, both Chicago and nationally. And first of all, it's just helped me develop as a professional. And I have a much better perspective, I think, of understanding the expectations of being on a for-profit public company board. And I serve a number of public companies and sit in their boardrooms, so that certainly has helped. But I do think what I think the search firms will say oftentimes, Cid, is they sort of discount the experience itself, or they believe companies discount it, but it does get back to the network and the relationships. And, I do think that most nonprofits are trying to have really good governance because they're stewards, right? And in achieving their mission, and typically they're getting funding from sometimes governments and other foundations and individuals. So they really want to use those monies wisely. So in the nonprofits I sit on, I know our goal is to have governance at a very strong and high level. So I do think they'll get good experience. But, oftentimes if you take on a sticky issue or an important role in a nonprofit, it really gives some of those, peer board members who may be a public company CEO who's looking for someone for their board, or they get that call and they can see how you handle yourself in the boardroom. They see that you truly can be a peer of other C-suite executives. And I think it really does matter. And it's amazing when people, when you have forums and people talk about how'd you get your first board seat, inevitably, there may have been a search firm involved, but oftentimes it is through some relationship, and a nonprofit board is not uncommon. That's one of the key ones. So I'd strongly support doing it, but then also recognize, you got to show up, you got to, really be engaged, because, you can't just be on the board. If they see you don't show up or aren't engaged, that's probably actually less helpful than more helpful, for sure.
So one question from the audience, and of course we'll use these last ones to get maybe one or two questions. I know you've answered. The good news is you've answered already a lot of questions that came from the audience, but one is about entrepreneurs and private business owners, and are they considered to be the kind of profile that a company is looking for to serve on their boards?
Yeah, I think absolutely they can be. And, it may be, one of the things we've been trying to do in some of our board ready programs is have people who talk about, public company boards, of which, there's a certain number of those, but there are many private company boards or startups or others that also are looking for board members. So I think entrepreneurial experience is probably invaluable in many private company and perhaps startup situations, but I think increasingly those skills are being, looked at on corporate boards as well. Part of it might be, again, what's your network? How do you get connected to those? But, obviously, as you think about many established companies, they are looking to grow. Oftentimes they're entering into new markets or even into new business lines, new business models. So, individuals who have started companies, who have built businesses, those skill sets are incredibly valuable. And I think if there is one thing I've heard coming out of the COVID environment, these are hard issues that every organization is dealing with right now. So they truly are looking for people who have, been willing to roll up their sleeves and, kind of get their hands dirty, or who can share perspectives from that. So I do think those skill sets are valuable and will continue to be valuable in the future.
Great, thanks. Well, so we're about out of time, and we know that this is a very interesting topic. Certainly, we encourage the audience to continue to follow us. You can visit our website at www.hacr.org, and as soon as our new missing pieces report comes out, we'll be announcing that publicly. But Deb, a big thank you to you for a very insightful presentation. I also should mention, since it is public, that Deb DeHaas is retiring after many years at Deloitte, and so we were really honored that that you took time to address our audience of Latino and diverse leaders who are looking for insights on trends on corporate boards. So with that, thank you so much again to Deb DeHaas, Vice Chairman at Deloitte. And with that, I will pass it back over to Vanessa Bowling-Ajavan, our Director of Administration and Human Resources. It's all to you, Vanessa. Thank you so much.
What a great discussion. Thank you, Cid. Thank you, Deb, for your time, your great insights that you shared with us, and for your continued commitment to the Hispanic community. Thank you again to today's sponsors, the Coca-Cola Company and USAA, for your continued support and partnership. Thank you as well to all of HACR's executive program sponsors. Without your commitment, our work would not be possible, and we would genuinely like to thank you, because we would be unable to fulfill our mission. And thank you all, our attendees, for taking time out of your busy day to join us for this discussion. We hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Please remember to follow us on social media to receive important details about our upcoming virtual events. The webinar schedule is also available on our website at www.hacr.org. Please remember to complete the survey that will automatically pop up once the webinar has ended. Thank you, and we'll see you again soon.